All right, so let's get into a few of the different builds you can go for the M240L. I built what I've used as pretty much my all-round build. Let me show you a little bit of how it works. I needed the light and suppressor. Really, there were moments where I tended to like hold down the fire button like in a bit of a panic, so I needed something to help me deal with some of that recoil. I liked the heavy extended barrel. I found some better success increasing the muzzle velocity just a little bit when I'm trying to fight at range. And then I went with the canted stubby grip because I needed a little bit of help with that aim down sight speed so that I wasn't losing as many of the up close and, in your face sort of battles. And then I also added the 75 round belt box because it also improved our draw speed and the aim down sight accuracy on moving. I don't know if I noticed a ton of that, but I definitely noticed a bit of it. If you needed to get a laser or something like that, you could drop the ammo. I had 5 points to spare, so I went ahead and put the rail cover. Anything I can help with my draw speed, because I am flipping weapons a lot of times where I'm, reviving teammates and all that sort of stuff. So in the firing range, that's when you use that same kind of recoil pattern I was talking about, where it's like you're doing the 1, 2, 3, 4, and like letting that final bullet kind of reset the chamber. You get a pretty tight fire pattern for yourself. I don't need a ton of the recoil control. So let me show you a couple of the other builds that also deal with that recoil control. Here's another one where I try to kind of think about how do I do a lot more of like up close and personal battling when I'm doing a lot of strafing left and right trying to fire at folks. So again, if you're trying to focus on I want a lot of additional support with aim down sight accuracy while I'm moving, so this would be the way to do it. Like we're going to get the blue laser, not the highest blue laser because you tend not to hip fire, right? Your aim down sights accuracy while moving. So hence you're aiming down the sight. So we went with the blue laser. You can grab the light barrel because that also supports it. And then getting the 75 round belt box. And lastly, I went ahead with the slim angled because the full angled has a penalty for aim down sights accuracy while moving. And then all I had left was maybe a little bit of support to getting the brake. You could go with a flash hider. You're losing a little bit of recoil, but I don't know if the recoil control of the brake really made much of a difference. So at least getting a flash hider, people are going to hear you because the gun's quite loud. And again, I stay away from that linear comp just because it throws the gun up in the air pretty harsh right at the outset to it. That was a way that I could get a gun that was like pretty good support in terms of like strafing back and forth, right? Keep you a little bit more on target. I noticed a bit when I put all of those things together. I didn't notice a ton of difference when I only used like 1 or 2 of them compared to all 4 of them. Now I will say for this particular gun, there is quite a penalty for moving in general. And so another way to do this is to get the long suppressor. And then I went with the light barrel because I wanted a little bit of support accuracy while moving. And then I flipped back to the canted stubby because I'm going to move a little bit, but not a ton in there. And then, so here I've got the 75 round belts and I've got the light barrel to improve the accuracy while I'm moving in case I'm actually moving. And then more often than not, I'm trying to sort of stay still. So I have that long suppressor in case I need to fire a little bit long term. And then obviously having a bit of the recoil control. So that is another way you can think about building yourself a somewhat balanced gun. Again, it all comes back to going into the firing range, like mastering a good recoil control firing pattern that you don't need quite as much in terms of grips and muzzles to control that. And you can devote things like you see in this build where you're getting more into aim down sight accuracy while moving in case that's really your sort of thing. But again, I would say to me, the most well-rounded build was something that looked more like this. We've got the light and suppressor, we've got the heavy extended barrel, so I can get the extra bullet velocity, the canted stubby, the bigger clip, the rail cover, and a sight. I do use this also with the thermal sight, and so if you're going to do the thermal sight, you have to make some sacrifices like dropping the rail cover and going from the light and suppressor down to just the standard suppressor is another way you can run this. So hope that helps you figure out some good builds and the way to use this particular fantastic gun. All right, so here's a bit of a comparison of how some of the grips have handled the recoil. So standing kind of at the far end of the room and just holding down the fire button for the entire time, you can see when you've got no grip, that's what the fire pattern is. And if you put the grip that has, a slight reduction of recoil and then moderate and so on and so forth, kind of like all the ways you go up, to me, I couldn't really tell the biggest difference between the 646H and then I think the full classical grip. So I tend to kind of stay in this middle road. I felt in terms of point cost, it gave me the initial recoil control that I needed when I'm doing my firing. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So if you just kind of use the base fire pattern I was giving you, where it's kind of like a long press and then a single press, right? Long press and a single press, like long press, single press, long press, single press. You can kind of get your bullets relatively tight. Now, if you use these two grips, like the one that does moderate recoil control, let me go to the grips and show you what I'm talking about. This one, the ribbed vertical that does the moderate recoil control, when you go into and you use that fire pattern, that's what it's going to look like at a pretty far distance, again, from across the room. That's what your fire pattern looks like. Now, when you roll up and spend an extra 15 points to get the classic vertical, using that same firing pattern I have, it tightened it up a little bit, but I'm not sure if it was worth the full 15 points. Additionally, you're getting some sort of an accuracy debuff while aiming down sights, and I'm trying not to do that, especially when I'm trying to fight at range. Again, when you're fighting close up, I don't know if all of this stuff really makes that much of a difference because of how hard this gun hits in those close sort of battles. So to me, it felt like the optimal was choosing that classic ribbed vertical. However, I will note when you're fighting up close, you may need to get a little bit of a boost to that aim down sight. The aim down sight time is pretty standard for an LMG, but it's a little slow. And so you may want to say, let's move up to, like the candid stubby to get that moderate recoil. It's the same exact grip as the 20-point vertical, that ribbed vertical. It's the same as the canted stubby. This just adds in some ADS time. So consider that when you think about your grips. I don't do a lot of gripping to the bipod. I'm sorry, grips to like surfaces. I also don't use the bipod that much. And I felt like you certainly could go with the angled and get, for 5 points less, you get a little bit of that reduction in recoil. Not quite as good as the stubby and the ribbed vertical, but you could use the full angled grip and get, that reduction to the aim down sights. Definitely interesting tries. I didn't notice a ton of difference between all three of them. I noticed a difference using the stubby and the angle to get that aim down sights accuracy boost, but in terms of recoil control, I couldn't tell the difference between the rib vertical, the canted stubby, and the full angle. They all produced pretty much the same recoil control when I'm using that base fire pattern. If you're doing the full auto fire pattern, then you may want to stick with the stubby or even roll up to one of these grips. Just know that you're losing some accuracy when you're aiming down sights. So that's my suggestion for the grips. Start with the ribbed vertical. If you're losing some of your battles because your aim down sights are too slow, you might want to roll up to the stubby grip to get a little bit of a boost to there. All right, when it comes to barrels, I couldn't see a massive difference in recoil control using that heavy extended. I know it says it does provide a little bit of recoil control, and I guess you can see there may be a little bit of recoil control compared to just the base heavy barrel. The short barrel, you could definitely tell there's like a little bit more recoil control using the basic barrel and then the heavy extended barrel. But in terms of pure recoil, I don't think it's worth it. I will say that getting that extra bullet velocity I thought was helpful for me because when I'm trying to shoot at range, and I didn't notice a ton of aim down sights accuracy while moving buff when I put on light barrel as opposed to not having it. I would say you may just need to test it, especially if you're going to use some of the grips that I suggested. You'll have a few extra points. You may want to try it on there and see, do you actually feel like you're getting an aim down sights accuracy while moving boost. I didn't quite feel it enough to really merit the extra points, but you might find it a little bit different. All right, so here's a little bit of the recoil control based on which muzzle that you're choosing. So again, on the far left, we've got the basic fire pattern and then the cheapest break, then the more expensive break. I felt like you can see kind of a bit of a clear difference between that most expensive break and having nothing whatsoever. When you do the linear comp, yes, you do get more of a straight line, but it pulls pretty hard. And so if you're trying to shoot at range, the gun pulls hard and linear break almost like amplifies how hard up it pulls. So to me, I found firing at range with that linear comp, although it made the recoil pattern control while pulling down, I had to pull down so sharp it was throwing my aim off at range. Then we come to the four suppressors, the base suppressor, the long suppressor, the CBQ, and then the lightened suppressor. I could see a little bit of a difference between the long suppressor and the lightened suppressor. They both have a bit of a recoil control. The base suppressor and the CBQ kind of did roughly the same thing. So I'd say in terms of if you want to do full on firing of this gun, you might want to consider doing, the stronger of the two brakes and either the long suppressor or the lightened suppressor to give you a little bit of recoil control. It's somewhat more manageable because you can kind of pull straight down on it. All right, so let's get into the M240L. For the LMG class, it really is a fantastic gun. I wouldn't say it's the best gun in here. It's got a pretty interesting use case to me at kind of close to mid-range. I'll show you why I struggle with it at long range. I played with it quite a bit. I've got a couple of different attachments I'm going to show you, but what's most important is really the way that I tend to use it in terms of shooting this particular gun. So I go into the firing range and I kind of mimic a medium-ish, rather than just going all out, holding down the fire button, because you're going to notice that recoil pattern just keeps drifting up and kind of bouncing all over the place. Come on, radio. We're done with you, radio. The way that I tend to fire this is really in kind of every fourth, fifth, sixth-ish bullet, I'm going to try to reset the barrel. So I'll do kind of a long press and then a click. So a long press and a click, long press and a click. And what that does is kind of keep all of your bullets relatively in a tight pattern, mostly straight vertical. And so if we go back in here, so we don't have to spend all the time reloading. So if you do long press and a click, long press and a click, and you just keep pulling down on your barrel, you're going to keep your fire pattern in a pretty close pattern, versus if you try to hold down too long. Notice if you hold down too long, you start spiking out a little bit too far, right? Long press and a click, long press and a click. Right? You can keep your shooting pattern pretty tight, almost like a tight football spiral. But I'll show you where this thing struggles. When we get to range, you'll notice that first bullet kick is pretty extreme and it throws the gun up. And so even doing the long press and click, I find that I have to even shorten the first press so that I can reset the barrel at a target that's really far away, right? This guy's 70 meters or something like that. But anybody that's in the middle, like the long press and a click, does pretty well. Right? I don't there are no attachments on the gun, and so I feel like that particular style of fire pattern tends to work for me the best, and it's a lot easier when you put some attachments on the gun. So I would consider that is a good way to think about its fire pattern. And then I do want to note that it does have a little bit of slow rate of fire and that big bounce off that first bullet. So that's why I feel like I've struggled a bit with it at range, but you may find it a little bit different for you. So now let's get into some of the attachments.